Welcome to the Proceedings podcast. I'm Bill Hamblett, the editor-in-chief of Proceedings at the U.S. Naval Institute. Today is Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023. Good to have you on board, as always, everybody. Today's show is brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute. Since 1873, going on 150 years this October, the members of the Naval Institute have been the foundation of everything we do, from Proceedings to Naval History magazines to USNI News, to professional books and conferences and events. If you enjoy the show, ring the bell, subscribe, recommend us to your friends, and become a member of the Naval Institute at usni.org/join. All right, let's get to our guest. Joining me from Northern Virginia today is Eric Wertheim. He's the author of the Naval Institute Press book, Combat Fleets, and he's the author of the monthly Proceedings column of the same name. And just before the show, we were chatting, and Eric reminded me that coming up in early 2024, he will be reaching the 30th year of publishing and of writing Combat Fleets for Proceedings. So that is darn impressive. You got a lot more bylines than I ever had, Eric. Great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Yes, absolutely. I started doing a history column for 10 years, called Lest We Forget in 1994. And then in 2004, took over the Combat Fleets column from my predecessor, Dave Baker, and it's been really fantastic just studying the world's navies and being able to coordinate and learn and bring that information to our members and to the Naval Institute team and the Navy and our allies.
And you're also on the show today, not just because of those two, the book and the ongoing column, but also last year and this year, we asked you to write a special piece for the May International Navies issue about NATO navies, sort of an update of going through all 31 countries now. What are the major highlights, both in their operations and particularly in their shipbuilding programs? Everything from the Belgian Navy, Danish Navy, all the way through to I guess Turkey and Finland, et cetera. So. Overall, I just want to start off by, just recounting for a lot of folks are aware that the U.S. Navy now for a while has been struggling to get back above the 300 ship mark. Are NATO navies actually getting bigger now, Eric? And if yes, which ones are growing fastest?
So I think it's a difficult thing to look at the size because we're looking in a lot of cases at larger warships. So in terms of the sizes, it's not really fair. We have to really look at capabilities. And in terms of capabilities, they're certainly growing. There was a period after the Cold War and with the focus on land war and the global war on terror where things were not going always in a positive direction for navies and NATO navies in particular, where there was a focus on counterterrorism and counterpiracy. But now in the past decade, and especially since the war in Ukraine, I think we're seeing a dramatic increase in the return to the more core missions of anti-air, anti-sub, anti-surface that the Navy is doing and that the navies of NATO are doing. And of course, most importantly among that is situational awareness, maritime domain awareness, and the ability to stay linked and connected. So we're absolutely seeing growth in capabilities of those navies. And we're seeing some across the board. We're seeing a lot of new surface ships, a lot of frigates, air defense frigates. We're seeing and multi-purpose frigates, and we're seeing a lot of very large amphibious assault ships. We're seeing aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships that can act as aircraft carriers. From the recent United Kingdom acquisition of the British Royal Navy has acquired 2 full-deck aircraft carriers for F-35B. Short takeoff, vertical landing strike fighters. The French are now beginning to look at a new aircraft carrier to replace their Charles de Gaulle. Italy has a new ship that is going to be the Trieste that will be getting F-35Bs and working with that. And as is Turkey, will not be operating, of course, F-35Bs due to their issues of acquiring the Russian air defense system. But instead, they're going to be looking at their aircraft carrier and amphibious assault ship as more of a unmanned platform mothership. And so we're seeing this kind of growth. Another area is submarines that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of navies acquire first-class submarines, really excellent for coastal defense. Also, they're getting air independent propulsion (AIP), which enables extended underwater time and really allows them to work seamlessly. And so we're seeing a lot of these new capabilities come in, and I think that if we look at that also, that's translating into really much more capable navies. But there are some gaps that we're seeing, and the navies are trying to address that. The challenge, of course, is sometimes it can take years to correct those gaps that have grown over time.
Oh, that's a great summary, Eric. And yeah, you reminded me of, there are some pretty impressive ships coming off the construction ways in European countries, in NATO countries, right? That's a great point about aircraft carriers. Even the Turks with that unmanned aircraft carrier that's coming online. The Queen Elizabeth, which made the deployment last year, a year and a half ago, with U.S. Marine Corps F-35Bs on board, and you got the Italian-French FREM frigate program, on which the Constellation class at the U.S. Navy is building now is based on that hull, loosely, I think. I'm hearing from some, but that's a really good point. What NATO countries are incorporating the Aegis weapons systems, and are those Aegis systems, as they come online, are they all compatible with each other?
Well, it's a very good question. So, of course, the Aegis, when we think of it right now, it's Spy-1, but the radar and combat system, of course, the United States operates it. Norway and Spain also operate NATO platforms, and Canada is now going to be buying 15 new air defense frigates, and these are going to be very, very capable. They're based on a Type 26 frigate from the United Kingdom, and they will be fitted with a Spy-7 Aegis, the Aegis radar, and it's going to be cooperative engagement capability for the Canadian warships. So that enables the real-time sensor netting for situational awareness, integrating fire control capability. That kind of thing is what's being looked at for the future. Recently, there was an article that Australia was the first allied ship, not of course in NATO, but to link and plan to get that cooperative engagement capability for their warships. And we're now seeing Canada do the same. Now, of course, for ships that do not have that cooperative engagement, there's still linkages that we do, and the multiple links, and we're also, of course, the big thing to remember is by training and exercise together, we build those bridges, we build those links so that we are able to work together. So right now we have Norway and Spain as carrying the Aegis on their warships. Of course, Canada in the future, and then Spain is also looking at a new fleet of frigates that will also have the Spy-7 combat system as well. And I think those are going to be really important for netting. And we look at some of the British, French warships, and they're very, very capable for air defense. The big challenge on a lot of these warships, I think, is the missile magazines, and are we buying sufficient weapons? That's, I think, one of the real challenges that we're facing. And I'm sure that's one of the things that'll come up. You'll hear me harp on throughout the podcast. I think that's one of the big challenges we're seeing in the war in Ukraine, and we're also seeing that in extended combat operations, we use a lot of munitions, and these munitions are very expensive, and they really need to. You can't just surge the production. It takes a long time, and I think we need to. NATO navies need to start thinking about this, and they are, but it still takes time to rebuild that production line.
That's a great point. How are NATO navies tackling unmanned capabilities? Are there any common unmanned programs that are coming online across the alliance? In other words, that more than one country is buying together, perhaps?
Absolutely. When I think of NATO and unmanned systems, I often think of together. I mean, they're going forward together on this. A lot of cooperation. Netherlands and Belgium are building a new mine countermeasures mothership class to be able to deploy unmanned systems. They're working together, and France has recently announced that they are joining that program. So they originally built a mine countermeasures fleet called the tripartite class. It was the Alkmaar in the Netherlands, and it was very successful. And you're seeing a lot of those ships as they retire from NATO navies. They are being sent to some of the NATO navies that have less budget, smaller budget, so that they can have a second life in those navies, like Bulgaria, some of the countries that were formerly in the Soviet bloc. And I think a lot of those are making great use of these secondhand mine countermeasures ships, while the NATO navies that have more of a budget are able to acquire the newer ships. Now, those are just the motherships. We're also seeing a lot of cooperation, a lot of coordination on unmanned mine countermeasures, unmanned systems to be able to integrate and work together. I think we're seeing that a lot. And recently, in 2022, there were a series of exercises to test unmanned systems that NATO has done. Scores and scores of these unmanned systems. I think the number in one situation was 120 unmanned systems, air, surface, and sub, working together, and platforms from different countries to see and work, because, of course, how you train is how you fight. So making sure that situation is working. And then, of course, NATO also has its own fleet of they're called Phoenix RQ-4 drones, and those, I believe there's 5 of them, and they operate out of Italy, and they are long-range unmanned air systems that are able to conduct extensive ISR collection, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and they work, of course, along with U.S. naval and air assets and our allies, and help integrate that information. And those are our assets that are jointly operated by NATO.
Do those come under the NATO command in down in Italy, down in Naples? Is that?
I believe they might be through the air side,
Okay.
but I know that they're operated out of Italy, and they are, since 2021, they have been operational. And as you talk to anyone who has been working or seen the kind of information that the Global Hawk can provide, or the Triton for the Navy, you see, these are similar platforms. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned that we're seeing from the war in Ukraine, is how important intelligence is, and getting that intelligence where it matters. And of course, whether it's hunting submarines with P-8 Poseidon aircraft, which more of our allies are acquiring, or submarines, wherever it is, being able to get that information and share it where it's needed is so important. And having a robust linkages, so that resilient linkages, so that they can stand up in the face of whether it's jamming or just loss of some of those systems. I think that's so important. That's why it's so important that NATO continue to test and work those things.
Got it. So Eric, a lot of folks who served in the U.S. Navy towards the end of the Cold War will remember that we sort of relied heavily on our NATO allies to provide and maintain the mine countermeasures capability. That the U.S. Navy did not have a large mine countermeasures, still doesn't, a large mine countermeasures capability. We relied on the allies to have that. Is that still true today? And do most of NATO's MCMs still reside in non-U.S. navies?
A lot of the capability for NATO is residing in the NATO navies, and they have prioritized that. It's something that especially the smaller navies are able to help out with. We saw, for instance, in the Black Sea, we saw Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, and of course Ukraine as well, neutralized about 40 mines in the past year, naval mines that have drifted and been dangerous to shipping, and they've been able to neutralize those just in the past year as a result of the conflict. And it shows the importance of mine warfare, because just imagine, in any kind of larger conflict, just the sheer numbers of mines and how challenging that will be to clear those. So I think absolutely it is something, especially unmanned, You see, as I mentioned before, the Belgian and Dutch have invested very heavily in acquiring this new fleet of mine countermeasures motherships with unmanned systems, and I think that's a perfect example of that kind of work that they're doing together. And I think you're going to see that come to fruition as they start coming on board in the next few years. It's really going to start paying dividends. Of course, the U.S. also still brings a lot of important mine countermeasures capability to the fight, so we don't want to overlook that. What I think that one of the key parts about mine warfare to remember is it's really an area where smaller navies can contribute, and where a lot of them have been able to find a key strength. And I think that's also true for offensive mine warfare. I think that's an area that's often been overlooked. And when you look at for a country on the defensive, where if something were to happen and we need to protect ports or need to target enemy ports, offensive mine countermeasure versus defensive mines are both very, very important. Offensive mine operations or defensive, I think they're both very important. And NATO navies, it's an area that has been a gap, but they're starting to step up. The United States as well, of course.
Agreed. Yeah. So, Eric, the war in Ukraine has focused a lot of attention on the Black Sea region. Is there any significant naval buildup happening in Romania, Bulgaria, or Turkey? And any evidence of lessons learned from the war that's influencing those navies' force designs or shipbuilding programs?
Absolutely, we're seeing a lot. I'll start with Turkey because it's the largest of the NATO allies in that region, and one focus for Turkey has been developing its indigenous capabilities to be able to design and build its own warships. They're expanding on that, and to do that independently and potentially even become an exporter. They're having some success with certain munitions and certain weapons, and so we're seeing that as a development. And they're also licensed building submarines, and they're licensed building Anadolu, the large aircraft carrier amphibious assault ship that we were talking about. And first off, I should apologize also to some of our NATO allies when I butcher the pronunciation of some of their ship names. It's always a little challenging working with them in print or when they send something and the pronunciation can be a little off. So I do apologize if I'm butchering any of their pronunciations. But I do think that that when we look at Turkey, that's a perfect example. And I think the other things that we're seeing for a lot of these smaller regional navies and across the board are an expansion of their coastal defense cruise missile capabilities. We're seeing a lot of coastal defense cruise missile capability expansion, which is very, very important. It's an area where smaller navies can really contribute. And if you look at their location, right on the, in some key waterways, some of these navies, whether it, be in the Nordic region, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, some of those countries that are looking, that see vulnerabilities, Denmark, we're looking at a lot of these, and we're seeing a great expansion of that. And it's very important to see that, whether it is acquiring the Norwegian NSM naval strike missile, or from other countries, we're seeing a lot of capable anti-ship cruise missiles come in and be added for coastal defense. That's going to continue growing. And what that also means is the older anti-ship missiles, such as Harpoon, are really, in a lot of ways, being phased out. And we've seen 10 NATO navies now are planning to acquire the naval strike missile to replace and to, in most cases, replacing the Harpoon anti-ship missile, which is just really getting long in the tooth. And the naval strike missile is really, for those of the listeners and watchers, that viewers that are not completely aware or familiar, it's the naval strike missile is a fifth generation missile. It's 100-mile plus range. It's got GPS, imaging, infrared, sea skimming, inertial guidance. It's passive, so it's very stealthy. It's sea skimming, it's survivable, and it's really an important addition to the NATO navies. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future.
Yeah, I've been at the Raytheon Kongsberg booth at a number of naval shows, the naval, the surface warfare, the SNA conference, and at West. and at the Naval Submarine League, et cetera, and seen the full size mock up of the Naval Strike Missile, and had them seen the video and the brief, and it's impressive. And particularly talking to a couple of the Kongsberg engineers who designed and helped build that thing, and they talk about the stealth. They talk about the end game maneuvers that it's capable of making, and being able to defeat anti-ship anti-missile defenses, right? So it's coming in against the AK-630, the Russian version of this close-in weapon system, and it's quite capable against that and other systems. So pretty cool missile. And we're the U.S. Navy is also procuring that weapon system.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the 10 NATO navies that are planning to acquire that, and have been acquiring it for both the LCS, littoral combat ships, and the new Constellation class, which is going to be a really important asset. There's a lot of these new capabilities that are being added, I think, that are really changing the dynamic and bringing NATO up to catch up. During the global war on terror, during 2001 to 2011, the navies really took a pause in their core missions, and I think that those core missions, air defense and anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface, those types of operations, resiliency, they really took a back seat to fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and GWAT around the world. Now we're seeing that catch up, and it's taking some time. But in the past, since about 2012, they've really been new systems and new weapons coming on board. SM-6 for the U.S. Navy is dramatic improvement, and we're seeing a lot of new programs, submarine programs, that are also being seen. One thing I had not mentioned is all three of the NATO nuclear powers, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, are building new naval assets of their triad. So we're having the British are building their new Dreadnought class. The United States has the new Columbia class SSBNs, and the French are also now starting to plan for their next SSBN follow-on. So we are seeing that they're investing in this for the future, and of course on the SSBN side, but also the nuclear attack submarine and the conventional attack submarines.
That's a great point. Eric, what are some new technologies? We talked a little bit about unmanned capabilities, and you mentioned the importance of ISR and how the war in Ukraine has just emphasized or foot stomped that requirement. But what are some new technologies that are being considered across NATO navies, and then perhaps you can talk a little bit about some of the gaps that need to be addressed.
Absolutely, I think one of the things you've seen in the Ukraine war that we've often heard people say that that it's the most challenging, and it seems that the Russians are having so much trouble with, is combined arms. And I think that joint operations of working air, land, and sea together as needed is something that NATO is very proficient at. And an example of that, one of the weapon systems that's often overlooked that's currently in development, and I think is really key, especially in the Pacific, but also has some it could potentially have impact and in Europe, it's called the Rapid Dragon system. It's a really innovative system, and these are essentially pods of cells, missile cells, that can be put into C-17 cargo aircraft or C-130 aircraft. And in the case of C-17, you have dozens of them. In the case of the C-130, you have smaller, and you could numbers, but about a dozen, I believe the number is, and you're seeing that they would be able to be put into these C-17s or C-130s, rapidly dropped out of them and they carry LRASM missiles, long-range anti-ship missiles, or JASM, joint air-to-surface standoff missiles with extended range, hundreds of miles range. And what that does in some ways is enable the assets to stay out of the fight. The air can engage against the sea, because a lot of times in the beginning, it's going to be very dangerous for surface ships. So in some ways, NATO navies might want to keep their surface ships out of the fight until enemy surface assets are neutralized. That might be a situation. and a system like coastal defense cruise missiles when there is range, or something like Rapid Dragon where it has a lot of applicability in the Pacific and also potentially in Europe, where you're able to drop large numbers of these anti-ship or land attack missiles. That's a really key area it's under development. I think we're seeing that. The big challenge is, do you have enough missiles? And that's a huge thing that I will keep coming back to. I don't think that we do have enough missiles. I think that we're seeing that. It's been acknowledged. I think a lot of these new weapons, they just need to enhance production, increase production. And I think that's an area where if we share production across the alliance, across the NATO alliance, it will have a lot of bonuses and a lot of benefits for across the board. Whether we're seeing that in artillery, which for 155 millimeter for land forces, they're able to engage surface ships in some ways. We're seeing land attack cruise missiles. We're seeing, even Marine Corps forces are often overlooked, but we saw with Snake Island the importance of being able to capture an island, being able to deploy weapons on that island, and being able to engage that island across the board. So all of those things, I often think back to the 1982 Falklands War, and I think that's a very useful example on a small scale of what some battles could be like when you look at some of the European islands. So, for instance, if you look at Gotland near Sweden, which of course is going to hopefully be a NATO ally soon. These are areas that need to be defended, and potentially might have to fight off an invasion force, or if a small island is captured, might need to be retaken. So I think we saw that with the Falklands. Of course, with the Falklands, we're talking about thousands of miles away from the United Kingdom, but in Europe, they would be much smaller distances often. But of course, we also have to look at the Arctic. Operating in the Arctic is an area we're seeing across the board that these are challenges we're facing, and we're also developing this new technology, whether it's submarines, new missile systems. As long as we are able to invest in the systems that they carry in sufficient number, I think those are some of the more important priorities.
So, Eric, I want to ask you a little bit more about that Rapid Dragon system. So, LRASM or other standoff weapons. Yeah. So, is that a pod system that goes inside the cargo hold of a C-130, or does it strap underneath? How does that work?
No, it goes in the cargo hold, and the aircraft, my understanding, would need to have a ramp. To the cargo plane would have a ramp. And think of all the countries that operate C-130s and C-17s as well. And yep. you have all of a sudden a lot of cruise missile carriers. And when in the past you had thought about naval assets and using bombers, as in the Cold War, we had Harpoon missiles fitted to B-52 bombers to be able to engage warships. And you're talking about now having cargo aircraft that the range is so long that the cargo aircraft would not be in range of air defenses. And what that does is it allows the cargo aircraft to operate as essentially long-range bombers or missile platforms, missile buses, in a way, and they can launch, go back to base, reload, and all of a sudden you're talking about a fleet of bombers, a fleet of aircraft that wouldn't need tanking if they have long enough range, or the missiles have just very long range. The question is, again, are we buying sufficient missiles? Because these are multi-million-dollar missiles, and they're really silver bullets in some ways. So being able to find alternatives, find alternative methods of production, being able to speed those up, those are key areas I think we have to think about. But I think I have seen very little written about the Rapid Dragon. I really encourage readers and listeners and viewers to check into it and see. It's been undergoing tests, and it's really something I think to be looked at, and I think it's very, very innovative, and it's mix of Air Force and SOF, but it also has a tremendous amount of naval implications just because of the LRASM use.
It reminds me of former CNO Greener's Proceedings article, maybe 7-8 years ago, which was maybe longer than that now ago, which was titled payloads, not platforms.
Absolutely.
And that's a great point, right? It's more about, and I think this is one of the significant lessons of the Ukraine war, is that it's more about the weapons themselves than it is about the payload or the platform. I'm sorry, the platform, and that which makes the ISR, your ability to sense and make sense of the battle space, much more important. And so perhaps the platform that delivers that payload is less important, and the payload itself and the magazine depth becomes more and more important. Well, Eric, this has been a great conversation. I thank you for writing again the NATO update for the International Navies issue this year. Unfortunately, we're about out of time. My guest today has been Eric Wertheim. He's the author of the Combat Fleets column and the author of Combat Fleets book from the Naval Institute Press, and the May issue of Proceedings, the NATO update. Eric, thanks for being on the show today.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. And thanks so much for sharing all this information. And 150 years, congratulations on the Naval Institute's 150-year anniversary coming up soon.
Thank you. Thanks for being a huge part of it. Well, this episode was brought to you by the members of the Naval Institute since 1873. The Naval Institute has fostered the free and open debate that has moved the sea services forward. To become a member, go to usni.org/join. And until next week, remember, victory begins at the Naval Institute.